Okay, we'll be in Acts 27. Before we get there, we want to give a little background to the 27th chapter of Acts. In Acts chapter 20, Paul is preparing to leave Ephesus, and he was determined to go to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 21, we have his record of his trip to Jerusalem, and we see his arrival in Jerusalem. And that ended his third missionary journey. We read in verse 17 of Acts 21, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly." And Paul would proceed to speak of the great blessings of God during his third missionary journey. So it was a wonderful time with the church at Jerusalem. In Acts 21, in verse 26 and 27, Paul goes into the temple. And beginning in verse 28, some who had seen him with Trophimus, who was a Gentile, they made an assumption. They made an assumption that Paul had taken Trophimus into the temple. And based upon that assumption, they accused him of defiling the temple. And that assumption, there's a message here about assuming. That assumption started a great riot in the town, and the people were about to kill Paul. In verse 33 of Acts 21, Paul is arrested. And from that point on, you read of several trials. Again, all of this because of an assumption. Be careful what you assume. He would stand trial before the Jews in chapter 22. He would stand trial before the Sanhedrin in chapter 23. He would stand trial before Felix 2 times in chapter 24. He would stand trial before Festus in chapter 25, and Agrippa in chapter 26. He is declared innocent by Festus. He is declared innocent by Agrippa. He is sent to Rome. The reason is because he appealed to Caesar. And that brings us to chapter 27. Paul is now on a prison ship along with 275 other people. We read that in verse 37. Verse 37 of Acts 27, we read there were 276 people aboard. So there were 275 people with Paul on this prison ship. It would be a journey of approximately 2,100 miles. And this 27th chapter is the account of this voyage to Rome. It's one of the great narrative chapters of the Bible, told in first person, we assume by Luke, indicated by the pronoun we, occurring 18 times throughout this 27th chapter. So what we have here is an eyewitness account of what took place during this voyage. Most of the narrative deals with a storm that would ultimately end in the wreck of the ship. and what transpired during that storm. And that's covered from verses 14 through verse 44. The account is filled with a variety of events. We just spoke earlier on events. And it's indicated by a couple of words. There's the word when. Notice verse 1. And when. Verse 4. And when. Verse 5. And when. Verse 6. And when. Verse 9. And when. Verse 13. And when. Verse 15. Verse 17, it is which when. Verse 20, and when. Verse 27, but when. Verse 28, a little ways down there, and when. And we see the same thing, verse 35, and when. Verse 38, verse 39, verse 40. And then there's another word. There's the word then. You see it in verse 20. Was then taken away. You see it also in verse 29. Then. You see it again in verse 32. Then. You see it again in verse 36. Then. There's also the words, and the next day. We read that in verse 3, and the next day. And the next day. And verse 9, much time was spent. Verse 14, but not long after. But not long after. And in verse 44, it came to pass. All of these are phrases of time. Every one of them. Phrases of time. They all serve as connections, connectors. And in addition to this, there are several places mentioned through Acts 27. And there are different people mentioned as well. So our subject is the when and then of life. Again, things are always happening. The when and the then of life. What we see here in Acts 27, and we've preached several series on this passage, not here, but has a picture of life. This 27th chapter really is a picture of life. It's how we ought to live our life as a child of God, regardless of the when, regardless of the then, regardless of circumstances. So the first thing I want to do is just make some general observations. Each one of these could be a message. Some general observations about life. Number one, God puts people in our lives. We see here in verse 37, we're told that there were 276 people aboard the ship. In verse 1, we read, there were certain other prisoners. God brought all these people together, put them on this ship. That's God's doing. We see also that mentioned by name was a centurion. And he had the charge, it was his responsibility to bring these prisoners, specifically Paul, to Rome. And his name is given. It says that he is Julius, a centurion of Augustus band. God put him on that ship. God put Paul on that ship. And in verse 3, this Julius courteously entreated Paul. That is, he treated him kindly. God put someone on that ship that would treat Paul with kindness. And what he did was that he gave Paul liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. These were people that Paul had come to know through his missionary journeys. We come to know people through life. That's all of God. God puts people into our lives. And amongst thee, in verse 2, there's also a man named Aristarchus. He's also, and you'll read more of him throughout Paul's epistles. He's one of Paul's close friends. He was a missionary companion. He's identified in chapter 19 of Acts and verse 29 as a companion of Paul in travel. Now they're on this ship going to Rome. In Colossians 4:10, he's a fellow prisoner. In Philemon 24, he's a fellow laborer. God knew everything that was going to happen during this journey that we read of in Acts 27. And God had people in place. That's always true. That's always so. God puts people into our lives. And whom God puts into your life today, you may not see him again for 10 years. And then 10 years from now, you'll know why God put that person in your life. We see also that there are many changes in life. Things do not stay the same. Again, in verse 3, there is an act of kindness shown to Paul. There was a liberty, a time of sweet fellowship, and encouragement amongst friends. But in verse 4, and when we launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because, he's going to tell us the reason, the winds were contrary. So he's moved from a time of sweet fellowship and encouragement amongst his friends, and now he's in the midst of contrary winds. Things have changed. And those contrary winds resulted in a slight change of course for that ship. Our course in life can change drastically, or there can be a slight shift in just a matter of minutes. Things do not remain the same. In verse 5, they arrive in Myra, a city of Lycia, and it was there that Julius, remember him, he's the one who has charge of the prisoners. This original ship they were on was not intended to go to Italy. It wasn't made for that. But we see here that he found a ship that was going that way. So he transferred the prisoners to that ship. Probably a bigger ship, probably a better ship, which is a good thing, considering the storm that they would face. God was arranging everything. Always is. He always is. Following this, in verse 7, due to contrary winds, there was slow sailing for many days. And when we had sailed slowly many days, for many days things just slowed down and was due once again to opposition. It was due to contrary winds. In verse 8, they almost wreck. And there was damage done to the ship. But they come unto a place called the Fair Havens. Now it's a time of comfort. It's a time of rest. But then notice verse 9. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous. So they've come from the Fair Havens to now it's dangerous. Things have changed. Things do not remain the same. We read in verse 13, the south wind blew softly. Again, there was smooth sailing, a time of ease. But in verse 14, but not long after that south calm wind, there arose a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. It's a typhoon. So they've gone from gentle blowing south winds to a typhoon-like wind, to a whirlwind. And we read in verse 15 that the ship was caught. That is, it was carried about by the force of the wind and the waves, and could not bear up into the wind. In other words, any attempt to gain control of the ship, it was in vain. The ship was out of control. Things are now out of control. Verses 16 and 17, the storm brought much damage to the boat. There's time when damage is done, when there's hurt and wounds. But the stormy wind would then carry them into a certain island, which is called Clauda. And there they would find some relief. God would give them the opportunity to make the needed repairs to the ship. But guess what? They couldn't stay there. They couldn't stay there. The reason they couldn't stay there was, well, they had to get to Rome, but there was another reason. There was quicksand. As they're there, they discovered there's quicksand. So they set sail again. And notice verse 18. And we being exceedingly tossed with tempest, the next day they lighted the ship. We being exceedingly tossed with tempest. Everything seemed to be out of control. And we read in verse 19 that it was a time of loss. We cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Things had to go. Had to get rid of some stuff. Some of it perhaps valuable. It was a time of loss. Verse 20. It was a time of darkness and no direction. Notice, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. It was a time of hopelessness, time of darkness. And we read in verse 27, but when the 14th night was come, this went on for 2 weeks, the storm. The storm was long. The storm was ongoing, day after day, night after night. It says we were driven up and down for 14 days, 14 nights. It was a time of discomfort. It was a time of fear. But in verse 27, there was some encouragement. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. Someone on the ship said, "Look, there's land. I think I see land." And now there's hope. They've gone from 14 days of storm, and now suddenly there's a ray of hope. This was soon followed by fear and shipwreck. And in verse 42, the soldiers desired to kill the prisoners, fearing that they would escape, and these soldiers are responsible. But in verse 43, Julius, remember him? The centurion intervenes. He says, no one's going to be killed. And he does so for the sake of Paul. And he commands everyone overboard. Verses 43 and 44. All the changes of life. Many whens, many thens. All through this account we see our lives illustrated. Let's look at Paul's behavior during all these changes. Change is going to happen. We bring some change because of our own foolishness. But most change you have no control over. None. But we're to behave a certain way, regardless of all the changes. In the account, there are some things about Paul that serve as an example to you and I living our lives regardless of when, regardless of then, regardless what the next day may bring, regardless of but not long after, regardless of it came to pass. We're to be what we ought to be. Nothing changes that. And we're to do what we ought to do. Nothing changes that. So notice some things about Paul. Prior to this chapter, Paul had prepared himself to pay any price to do God's will. Notice back in Acts chapter 20, that's where he's preparing to leave for Ephesus. We've already mentioned these things in the background. But notice he's going to leave Ephesus. He's going to head to Jerusalem. Verse 22. And now he's speaking to the Ephesian elders, the pastors of the church of Ephesus. Behold, I go bound in the Spirit unto Jerusalem. He says, I go unto Jerusalem because it's what I have to do. I know it's what God would have me to do, and I have to go. Not knowing the things that shall befall me there. You ask me what's going to happen when I get to Jerusalem? I have no idea. I don't know. But that doesn't concern me. Because I know it's God's will for me to go to Jerusalem. Verse 23, save, though I don't know all things that shall befall me, I do know this. The Holy Spirit witnesseth in every city, saying that bonds and afflictions abide me. He said, God has told me this. I want you to go to Jerusalem. And when you get there, there's going to be bonds and afflictions. Remember all the trials. Remember he was arrested. And all the trials. Well, that would stop most of us. I want you to go to such and such place, and when you do, you're going to be arrested, and you're going to have bonds, and you're going to have afflictions. Okay, I know that's not where God wants me to go. Paul knew it was where God wanted him to go. But none of these things, what are these things? Bonds and afflictions move me. They don't deter me. They don't deter me. God's people today, they want to go to places where everything's going to work out fine. And I know it's God's will because it's just a good place. Well, that's contrary to what we read here. Again, if God were to tell us to go to wherever, India, and when you get there, you're going to be arrested. That can't possibly be God's will. Oh, yes, it can. Oh, yes, it can. When you get there, your life's going to be rougher. Your life's going to be more difficult. Well, I know that's not where God wants me. It may very well be. You see, we judge God's will by our own comfort. And that's not the standard of measure. But none of these things move me, and here's why. Neither count I my life dear unto myself. He's saying these things do not move me because life is not about me. It's not about me. It's not about my comfort. It's not about what I want. It's not about what I desire. It has nothing to do with the will of God. My life is not dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy. If I go there, I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be put in prison. But if I go there, I will finish my course with what? Joy. There's bonds, there's affliction, but following God's will, there's what? Joy. So that I might finish my course. And who determined his course? God did. God did. So, Paul had prepared himself to pay any price to do God's will. And if we do that, it'll end in joy. Even though it might end with bonds and afflictions. So that you might finish your course with joy. So that's the foundation of Paul's behavior. He did not count his life dear unto himself. Secondly, Paul saw, again, life changes. Life has different situations. But Paul saw these situations as opportunity to proclaim the Lord. Every situation, though you and I like some situations better than others, that's true. There's nothing wrong with that. I would rather have peace than war. We like some situations better than others. There's no doubt. But situations are not always what we want. They're not always what we desire. But every situation is a forum for you and I to declare God. And Paul saw that. Paul recognized that. So here's Paul. He's a prisoner. He's on his way to Rome to stand trial. Certainly not the ideal situation. And there comes this violent storm. The waves crash into the ship. The crew, you can only imagine, is screaming. The captain is shouting orders. The tension and the chaos are mounting on that ship. And they eventually get to a spot where all hope is gone. And Paul sees this as an opportunity. He stands up to encourage all those that God put in his life for that moment. Everyone on that ship needed to hear what Paul had to say. And God put Paul there to say it. Paul saw that opportunity. Oh, how many opportunities we miss. And you know why we miss many opportunities? It's because we get our eyes on the whens and the thens, and the circumstances, and we forget, I have an opportunity here. I have an opportunity. God's put me here amongst this people. And I have an opportunity to declare the Lord. So whatever the when and the then, there are others. Paul wasn't the only person on that ship. There were others. And they needed to hear the Lord. We need to always think of that. There's always others. Always others. Regardless of the when and then, but not long after, and it came to pass, at some point we got to stop just thinking of me. We need to consider there's other people, they have needs. And I have what they need. And Paul proclaims the Lord. We may have absolutely nothing to do with our when and then. Having said that, keep in mind, there is a thing called consequences. You behave this way, this is going to happen. You do this, this is going to happen. But in this case, that's not the case. This was none of Paul's fault. And many times that's our case. We do not bring all our whens and thens upon ourselves. But we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility, and we need to view all of our situations as opportunities. Notice also that Paul maintained fellowship with God. In all the changes, there was an awareness of the presence of God. He said in verse 23, "For there stood by me this night the angel of God." And when someone is standing right next to you, you know that. You can see it. You can feel it. Even if you're blind, you know when someone is standing right next to you because you can feel the presence. And that's what Paul is describing here. He says, "For there stood by me," I felt it, "the angel of God." In the midst of the storm, he felt the very presence of God. That ought to be our life. We ought to always want to feel the presence of the Lord. Regardless of the when, regardless of the then, regardless of the but not long after, regardless of the it came to pass, we need to know and we need to feel the presence of God. But there was something else. There was also a present voice. It says there in verse 23, "For there stood by me this night, saying," the one who stood by me, I could feel his presence. He spoke to me. Now think about that. 275 other people on that ship. In the midst of a violent storm. There were voices on that ship, a variety of voices on that ship. But who did Paul hear? Heard the Lord. And why was he able to hear the Lord? Why was he able to sense the presence of God? Because through all the changes, he maintained fellowship with God. Here's the way many of God's people operate. They go through the joys of life, oblivious of God, oblivious of the blessings of God, give little thought to God. All of a sudden, trouble comes, and God is a fire escape. So they begin to cry out to God. And God in His mercy and God in His long-suffering answers them. They get through that storm, and there they are again, oblivious of God, until the next crisis. And that's how they live their life. And they call themselves Christians. They're anything but. But Paul, the way to do this is maintain fellowship with God through all the changes. Then when the storm comes, when you so desperately need God, you don't have to spend all that time getting right. You just maintain fellowship all along. That's the way to live. That's the Christian life. And that's what Paul did. Through all these changes, he just stayed in contact with God. God spoke to him. He spoke to God. There was a relationship. And that ought to be our life. He heard God. He maintained fellowship. Also, Paul never lost sight, regardless of the whens and the thens. He never lost sight of who he was. Never lost sight of who he was. Notice verse 23. Acts 27. I got to get over there. Verse 23. "For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve." Paul spoke of belonging to God. Whose I am. Regardless of what happens, I'm the Lord's. I'm His property. Whose I am. That speaks of a relationship between Him and God. In that statement, whose I am, I believe there is an awareness of God's love. There's an awareness of God's grace, His mercy. and His care. He's saying, I belong to God. This was right in the midst of the storm. I belong to God. Everything's going to be okay. Oh, it may not turn out the way I want it to, but everything's going to be okay. Because I belong to God. He realized and was aware that he was the absolute property of God. This goes back to, neither count I my life dear unto myself. I am the absolute property of God. But he also said that he was God's servant, whom I serve. Whom I serve. Regardless of the when, regardless of the then, regardless of the not long after, regardless of the it came to pass, we need to be aware of this. I belong to God. And I am an object of His love, His grace, His mercy, and His care. And I am here to serve Him. Never lose sight of that. I may be in a situation that I would have never chosen to be in. But I am in this situation as a servant of God. As a servant of God, I'm to do His bidding. I'm to be in His will. The servant of God. Regardless of the situation. I'm not to go my own way. Because I'm His. And I'm His servant. And that means that I am to prefer and esteem Him above all else. Oh, I may rather be in a different situation and under a different set of circumstances. But our attitude is, I prefer and esteem Him above all else. Regardless of the when and the then. He is to be our resolve. He is to be our purpose. He is to be our object. He is to be our aim. He is to be our passion. It usually doesn't work that way with God's people. God's people, you're in a storm for 2 weeks. Lord, get me out of this. I'll do anything. Just get me out of this. And that's the whole focus. Get me out of this. That's a wrong focus. I'm not saying you can't pray that the Lord might deliver you from that. But that's not to be the focus. The focus is, I belong to Him. And I'm to serve Him. And no, I don't like this situation. And I don't like these circumstances. But it is my resolve. It is my aim. It is my passion. I'm going to serve Him. That ought to be our lives. Paul's our example. He also realized that God was in control. In verse 22, he made a statement of certainty. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. He's saying, here in the midst of the storm, all hope is gone. And he says, I want you all to be encouraged. For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you. Now one of you is going to die. Well, how did he know that? God told him. But there's going to be difficulty because the ship's going to be wrecked. Not any man's life among you but the ship. The ship's going to be destroyed. But no one's going to die aboard this ship. You're on a plane and you're going to crash and someone stands up, don't worry, no one's going to die. The plane's going to be completely demolished, but no one's going to die. That's basically what Paul was saying. Why could he say that? What he's saying is, God has told me, and I know God's in control. God's in control. And then notice verse 25. He says, it shall be even as it was told me. I don't understand it, but I know it's going to be just like God said. That needs to be our assurance all the time. I don't know what's going to happen, or I don't know how it's going to happen, but I know it's going to happen because God said it would. And it shall be just as He said. Then notice, Paul believed God. Verse 25. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. I believe God. Regardless of when, regardless of then, regardless of the next day, regardless of it came to pass, Paul says, I believe God. That needs to be us. No matter what. Believe God. When everything's going well, believe God. When everything seems to be out of control, everything seems to be falling apart, believe God. Believe God. Times of joy, believe God. In times of sadness, believe God. This is a happy time in your life. Oh, I wish it could always be this way. Well, sorrow's coming. If you live long enough, you are going to experience sorrow. You're going to experience sadness. Believe God. Believe God. Times of health, believe God. You may not always be healthy. Sickness may be coming. Disease might be coming. Believe God. Believe God. Believe God in times of abundance. Believe God in times of destitution. Believe God in the midst of enemies. Believe God in the midst of friends. Paul said, I believe God. Oh, we need a people that would stand up and say, I believe God. I believe Him. May not make sense to the human mind, but I believe God. This provides establishment, continual belief in God. Jesus said to the disciples, have faith in God. Have faith in God. Believe God. 2 Chronicles 20:20, believe in the Lord your God, so shall ye be established. This is how you become steadfast. This is how you stand. Believe God. Just believe what God has said. Live your life according to what God has said. So shall you be established. The winds and dens will not move you. You have a foundation. That foundation is God. Believe His prophets, so shall you prosper. 2 Chronicles 20:20. So it's this belief that gives us establishment. It causes us to prosper, to advance. Believe God. How do you rise above the happenings of life? Through the decades, I've learned a lot about people. And one thing I've learned about God's people is most of them can't handle much of anything. they're going to fall completely apart or quit altogether. How do you rise above the happenings of life? Believe God. Believe God. Get your eyes off yourself. Get your eyes on Him. Believe God. Another thing I've learned is a lot of God's people don't think right. You say, well, you just think that if they don't think like you, they don't think right. No, that's not it. If they don't think according to this book, they don't think right. How do you think right? Believe God. That's how you think right. You remove God from the picture, your thinking is messed up. It's skewed. How do we not be mastered and controlled and governed by the happenings of life? Believe God. Believe God. People will tell you a lot of things. People will give you all kinds of advice. Everybody's experts. One thing I've learned is most experts don't know much anything. Believe God. Believe God. How do we ascend spiritually? How do we stay connected to God? Believe God. Just believe God. Man will tell you all kinds of things. Believe God. Well, so-and-so said. I don't really care what so-and-so said. Believe God. This is where we find victory. 1 John 5:4, this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. Believe God. So here Paul say, I believe God. Can we say that? Oh, we can all say it, but is it true? We learn from our text in closing, things are always happening. And these things can be polar opposites within minutes. You might be having the time of your life, and the telephone rings, your cell phone rings, and your whole life can change in a matter of seconds. Everything changes. Everything. It'll never be the same again. But regardless, God is who He is. God is who He is. People will say, well, I could never go through such and such. Oh, you can. I don't want to. There's a lot of things I hope I never go through. There's a lot of things I hope I never experience. But if I do, I can get through it. And I can come out victorious. But I have to do what's right. I have to be what I need to be and do what I need to do. Need to believe God. So regardless of when and then, God is in control. And regardless of when and then, we are not to be controlled and identified. The whens and thens are not to identify our life. God is to identify our lives. We're not to be diverted by the whens and the thens. I've seen people through the years experience tragedies in their life, be the death of a child, many things. And they remain faithful to God. And to this day, they're still faithful to God. Then there are others. They experience what they call a tragedy. It's nowhere near the death of a child or something along that line. And they quit. And they quit. Well, it's a personality thing. No. No, personality doesn't have a thing to do with it. It's an upbringing thing. No, I'm sorry. That's not it either. It's a spiritual thing. It speaks of where their spiritual foundation has been. Regardless of events, we're to maintain a relationship with God. Regardless. And we're to be identified by Him. So yes, things will change. There will be changes that we consider good. There will be changes that we consider bad. There will be changes that bring us joy. There will be changes that bring us sorrow. But that's not what it's about. What it's about is our relationship with the Lord. So regardless, may we maintain a proper relationship with God. What a way to live life. You live your life in relationship with God and you wake up with Him. What a way to live life. What a wonderful life. There's no better life than to live in relationship to the Lord. But that requires a lot of effort. Requires effort. Requires you and I being where we ought to be spiritually. So God help us, whatever is to come in our lives, that we would be what we ought to be, do what we ought to do. Brother Stephen, if you'd come and lead us in verse of song.